Dean Martin was reading his morning newspaper when he saw the headline that made his coffee cup freeze halfway to his lips. Sinatra bombs in Chicago. Career over. Below, it was a photo of Frank walking off stage after just 20 minutes, leaving 3,000 furious fans demanding refunds. But Dean knew something the newspapers didn't know. Frank Sinatra hadn't bombed. Frank Sinatra had been sabotaged, and Dean Martin was the only person in the world who could prove it. The call had come at midnight, 3 days earlier. Not from Frank. Frank was too proud to ask for help, even when he was drowning. The call came from Jilly Rizzo, Frank's closest friend and bodyguard, a man who never panicked about anything. "Dean," Jilly's voice was shaking. "Something's happening to Frank. Something bad. And I think someone's doing it on purpose." Dean had been in his study, going over sheet music for an upcoming recording session. He set down his drink and paid attention. Jilly Rizzo didn't call in the middle of the night unless the world was ending. "What kind of something?" Dean asked. "His voice, Dean. It's going. Not naturally. This is different. 3 shows in the last 2 weeks, his voice has completely failed him. Not tired, not strained, gone. Like someone turned off a switch." Dean frowned. Frank's voice was his livelihood, his identity, his soul. Frank Sinatra, without his voice, was like Dean Martin without his charm. Impossible to imagine. "Has he seen a doctor?" 5 of them. They all say the same thing. Nothing wrong with his vocal cords. Nothing wrong physically. But something is very wrong, Dean. And tonight in Chicago was the worst yet. Dean knew Frank had been struggling lately. The Kennedy administration, which Frank had campaigned for, had turned their back on him because of his alleged mob connections. The FBI was following him. The press was hostile. But Frank was a fighter. He didn't just quit, unless someone made him quit. "Jilly," Dean said slowly, "you think someone is poisoning Frank?" "I think someone wants Frank Sinatra gone," Jilly said, "and they're willing to destroy his voice to do it." The next morning, Dean Martin did something he hadn't done in years. He canceled his own commitments and flew to Chicago. Not to perform, not for business, but to investigate. He found Frank in his suite at the Palmer House, staring out the window at Lake Michigan. Frank looked terrible. Pale, drawn, older than his 47 years, but worse than his appearance was his silence. Frank Sinatra was never silent. "Heard you had a rough night, Pally," Dean said, sitting down across from Frank. Frank didn't look away from the window. "It's over, Dean. 40 years of singing, and it's over." "What happened out there?" Frank's laugh was bitter. "What happened? I opened my mouth and nothing came out. Not a whisper, not a croak, nothing. 3,000 people paid good money to hear Frank Sinatra, and Frank Sinatra disappeared." Dean studied his friend. Frank's speaking voice was fine. Rough from smoking and stress, but normal. Whatever was happening to him only affected his singing voice. "Tell me about the last few weeks," Dean said. "Everything. What you ate, where you went, who you talked to." Frank finally turned to look at him. "You think someone's doing this to me?" "I think you're Frank Sinatra," Dean said simply. "And Frank Sinatra doesn't just lose his voice for no reason." For the next hour, Frank walked Dean through his recent schedule. The pattern that emerged was subtle but unmistakable. Every time Frank had lost his voice, it had happened after drinking at the same private club in Chicago, the Chez Romano, an exclusive establishment where entertainment industry figures gathered when they were in town. "The owner there, Tony Romano, he's been real friendly lately," Frank said. "Keeps sending over drinks on the house. His best stuff, he says." Dean's blood ran cold. "Tony Romano? Tall guy, thin mustache, talks like he's from Boston but grew up in Sicily." "That's him. You know him." Dean knew him. Tony Romano wasn't just a club owner. He was a frontman for people who wanted Frank Sinatra out of the picture permanently. People who blamed Frank for bringing too much FBI attention to their operations. People who saw Frank's fall from political grace as an opportunity to cut him loose entirely. But they couldn't just kill Frank Sinatra. Too many people would ask questions. Instead, they were destroying him slowly, systematically, making him destroy himself. "Frank," Dean said carefully, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to set up another meeting with Tony Romano. Tonight." "Why would I do that? So I can humiliate myself again?" "Because," Dean said, "I'm going to catch the bastard who's been poisoning you." That evening, Dean Martin walked into the Chez Romano wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo and his famous smile. To anyone watching, he was just Dean Martin having a drink with a friend. But hidden in his jacket pocket was a small recording device, courtesy of a private investigator who specialized in industrial espionage. Tony Romano greeted Dean like an old friend, though Dean could see the calculation in his eyes. Romano was wondering what Dean Martin was doing here, and whether Dean knew anything about what was happening to Frank. "Dean, what a surprise! Frank didn't mention you were coming." "Decided to tag along at the last minute," Dean said smoothly. "Heard you pour a mean drink." Romano smiled. "Only the best for Frank's friends. What's your pleasure?" "Scotch." "Neat. Whatever you're giving Frank." Dean watched carefully as Romano prepared the drinks. The man moved with practiced efficiency, but there was something off about the way he handled Frank's glass. A slight hesitation, a movement toward a different bottle, then back to the main one. "Here you go, gentlemen," Romano said, setting the drinks down. Dean raised his glass. "To friendship," he said, looking directly at Romano. They drank. Dean's scotch was excellent, smooth, expensive, exactly what he'd expected, but he noticed Frank grimacing slightly after his first sip. "Something wrong with the drink, Frank?" Dean asked innocently. "Nah, just tastes a little different tonight." Romano's eyes flickered. "Different bottle," he said quickly. "Same brand, just a different batch. You know how it is." But Dean knew exactly how it was, and he knew he'd found his answer. The substance Romano was using was brilliant in its simplicity. A compound that temporarily paralyzed the vocal cords without affecting anything else. Tasteless, odorless, and virtually undetectable unless you knew exactly what to look for. The effects would last for hours, just long enough to destroy a performance and humiliate one of the greatest singers who ever lived. Dean excused himself to the men's room, where he used a payphone to call Jilly Rizzo. "It's Romano," Dean said quietly. "He's putting something in Frank's drinks, something that kills his voice." "Son of a bitch," Jilly breathed. "What do we do?" "We give Frank the performance of his life," Dean said. When Dean returned to the table, Frank was looking worse by the minute. His speaking voice was starting to sound strained, and Dean knew that within an hour, Frank would be completely voiceless again. "You know, Tony," Dean said conversationally, "I've been thinking about investing in a club like this. Mind if I take a look around? See how the operation works?" Romano hesitated. "Well, we're pretty busy tonight." "I'll make it worth your while," Dean said, pulling out a roll of cash. "Always looking for new business opportunities." Greed won out over caution. Romano led Dean on a tour of the club, pointing out the premium bar setup, the private dining rooms, the sound system. And in Romano's office, Dean saw what he was looking for, a small vial of clear liquid hidden behind some accounting books. While Romano was explaining the club's profit margins, Dean quietly pocketed the vial. "This is a real nice setup, Tony," Dean said. "Real nice, but I'm curious about something." "What's that?" "How long do you think it takes for someone to figure out you've been poisoning Frank Sinatra?" The color drained from Romano's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Dean held up the vial. "This what you've been putting in his drinks? Some kind of nerve agent? Something that paralyzes his vocal cords?" Romano backed toward his desk, his hand moving toward a drawer that Dean suspected contained a gun. "You can't prove anything," Romano said. "Actually, I can." Dean pulled out the recording device. "Been recording our whole conversation tonight, including the part where you admitted using different bottles for Frank's drinks." Romano's hand stopped moving. Here's what's going to happen, Dean continued, his voice still conversational but with steel underneath. You're going to tell me who's paying you to destroy Frank's career. You're going to give me the antidote to whatever this is, and you're going to disappear from Chicago tonight. And if I don't—" Dean smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Then I take this recording to the FBI, along with a sample of your poison, and I tell them how Tony Romano has been systematically trying to destroy one of America's most famous entertainers. How long do you think you'll last in federal prison?" Romano sat down heavily in his chair. "You don't understand the people you're dealing with, Martin." "I understand them perfectly," Dean said. "I grew up around them. The difference is, I chose a different path. You still have time to choose one, too." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Romano opened his desk drawer, not for a gun, but for another small vial. "This neutralizes it," he said, handing it to Dean. "2 drops in a glass of water. Frank's voice will be back to normal within an hour." "And who's paying you?" Romano shook his head. "I can't tell you that. You know I can't." Dean nodded. He hadn't expected Romano to give up his bosses, but he had what he needed. "Tony," Dean said quietly, "if Frank Sinatra's voice fails even one more time, if he so much as gets a scratchy throat after drinking anywhere, I'm going to assume it was you, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. Are we clear?" Romano nodded. Dean pocketed both vials and headed back to the main room, where Frank was slumped over the table, looking defeated. "Come on, Pally," Dean said, helping Frank to his feet. "Let's get some air." They walked out into the Chicago night, Frank barely able to speak above a whisper. "It's happening again," Frank said hoarsely. "My voice is going." Dean looked around, spotted a late-night diner across the street. "Let's get some coffee," he said. In the diner, Dean ordered 2 cups of coffee and discreetly added 2 drops from Romano's antidote vial to Frank's cup. "Drink up," Dean said. Frank drank his coffee slowly, not noticing anything unusual, but within 30 minutes his voice began to clear. Within an hour, he was speaking normally again. "Jesus," Frank said, touching his throat in amazement. "What the hell was that? I feel like myself again." Dean leaned back in the booth. "That, my friend, was someone trying to end your career, but they made one mistake." "What's that?" "They forgot that Frank Sinatra has friends who don't give up on him." Dean told Frank everything. The poison, Romano's confession, the systematic campaign to destroy his voice. Frank listened in growing fury and amazement. "So, what now?" Frank asked. "Now, you go back to your hotel and get a good night's sleep," Dean said. "Tomorrow you're going to give the performance of your life, and Tony Romano is going to be long gone from Chicago." The next night, Frank Sinatra took the stage at the Chicago Theater. Word had spread about his previous disasters, and the audience was skeptical, waiting for him to fail again. But when Frank opened his mouth and "I've got you under my skin" poured out in all its golden glory, the skepticism turned to amazement. Frank sang for 2 hours straight, his voice stronger and more powerful than it had been in months. Dean watched from the wings, along with Jilly Rizzo and a handful of other friends who knew what had really happened. "How did you know?" Jilly asked quietly. "Because I know Frank," Dean said, "and I know that Frank Sinatra doesn't quit. If his voice was failing, someone was making it fail." "But how did you know it was Romano?" Dean smiled. "Because Tony Romano has been trying to get close to Frank for months, sending over free drinks, acting like a friend. In our business, when someone tries that hard to be your friend, they're usually trying to be your enemy. Yeah, the sabotage attempt was never made public." Romano disappeared from Chicago that same night, and Frank never learned the full extent of how close he'd come to losing everything. Dean made sure the story stayed buried, not to protect the criminals, but to protect Frank's pride. But the incident changed both men. Frank became more cautious about where he drank and who he trusted. Dean became more protective of his friends, more aware of the enemies that success could create. Years later, when people asked Dean Martin about the secret to the Rat Pack's loyalty, he would think about that night in Chicago. "We look out for each other," he would say simply. "That's what friends do." But it was more than that. It was about understanding that in show business, success made you a target. It was about knowing that the people who smiled at you weren't always the people who wanted you to succeed. And it was about being willing to put everything on the line for a friend, even when that friend was too proud to ask for help. Frank Sinatra never knew that Dean Martin had saved his career that night in Chicago. Dean never told him, never asked for credit, never mentioned the risks he'd taken. Because that's what real friendship looked like. Not the public gestures or the grand statements, but the quiet moments when you put someone else's needs ahead of your own. The recording Dean had made disappeared, along with the evidence of Romano's poison. The only thing that remained was the knowledge that when it mattered most, Dean Martin had been there for his friend. And Frank Sinatra's voice, strong and clear, singing "My Way" for decades to come. Because sometimes the most important battles are the ones nobody knows you fought. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that save someone else's dreams. And sometimes the coolest thing you can do is make sure your friends never know how close they came to losing everything.